First then from hence turn to the orient sun, and past the height of these uncultured mountains, thence descend to where the wondering Scythians trained to beat the distant wounding bow on wheels aloft, roll on their wattled cottages. Potter's translation of Aeschylus. Oft o'er the trembling nations from afar has Scythia breathed the living cloud of war. During the century before and that succeeding the Christian era, the whole power, influence, and civilization of the entire known world were centered in one proud and despotic military state. Rome, by conquest and intimidation, had rendered herself mistress of all the explored and most favored parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Her legions held in obedience every nation, from the extremities of Greece to the British Isles and the Atlantic Ocean. Her eagles were born and dreaded from the sands of Egypt and Arabia to where the barbarous Teuton on the shores of the Baltic encountered the rough weapons of the Goth. The wide wastes of Scythia alone were to her unknown and untrodden plains. And from Scythia her final invaders and conquerors came. This name was the vague and general appellation bestowed by the Greeks and the Romans upon all the countries that extended from the banks of the Dnieper to the borders of the fabulous Cathay, the ancient name of China. In those days, they were divided by the ancients into European and Asiatic Scythia. To modern geographers, they are known as Russia and Tartary. The former as the barrier between Asia and Europe, the theaters of present action and civilization and past grandeur and fame, has been agitated from time to time by the revolutions with which both have been convulsed, and over her has the first fury of every tempest rolled that has so frequently burst forth from the center of the greater continent and rushed like a whirlwind over half the earth. From the depths of Tartary, or Asiatic Scythia, has originally issued every torrent of invading barbarians that have overrun Eastern Europe for the last 900 years, cradled on the gloomy steppes of Mongolia, where the earth for 9 months remains buried under a thick bed of snow, and where the sole vegetation consists of short grass and a few scanty tufts of heath. These hordes of martial shepherds have periodically poured down in search of a richer country and more grateful soil, and spreading over the barren plains of Tartary and Russia, have formed themselves into moving empires, who for a few years have domineered over the surrounding trembling nations, and then vanished and melted away, leaving little other trace of their existence than the record of destruction. Such were the monarchies of the Huns, the Igors and Avars, the Chasars, Polotzi, and Mongols, while the Ottoman Turks, who are also Scythian in origin and descent, more fortunate than their predecessors, have maintained a position in one of the finest countries of Europe for the last 400 years. As the most enduring, most powerful, and the most known, both in ancient and modern times, of these turbulent nations of the north, Russia occupies by far the most prominent part in the history of the Scythian empires, and I shall, therefore, make the annals of that country my principal subject. After tracing the origin of her people, I shall glance at the progress of the Huns, the Chasars, the Khazars, and the numerous other Tartar tribes whose names were only known by their inroads in the Middle Ages to the countries and inhabitants of Eastern Europe. Then, sketching the rise of the Russian monarchy, I shall proceed to the conquest of Genghis Khan and the Mongols. The conquest of Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and the wars of his descendant and still more formidable countryman Timur, with the short-lived domination of Samarkand. The ancient patrimony of the Tartars is now included in the empire of Russia and China, but their conquests, which extended over India, China, Russia, Siberia, and Greece, have left upon the inhabitants of both those countries a deep impress of their long and tyrannical sway, and there is great resemblance in many of their customs. Amongst these may be mentioned one which prevails alike in St. Petersburg, Peking, and Constantinople, which calls on the emperor or sultan, whenever a fire breaks out in the capital, to assist personally in its extinction. And there is great resemblance in many of their customs and laws, their jealousy of foreign nations, dress, appearance, and character, and despotic, patriarchal form of government. The same exclusive character decrees, forbidding emigration, rigid adherence to ancient usages, and numerous secret societies. Political and religious are alike remarkable in both, and both empires have been frequently subdued and ruled by foreign invaders and savage warlike hordes, and exhibiting a vitality almost unknown to the nations of Europe, have risen again from their ashes, and, emancipating themselves from their conquerors, have flourished again with renewed vigor and prosperity. But the Chinese, who since that time have once more fallen under Tartar rulers, with whom and the natives, a war has long been raging, with threatens to tear in pieces the whole celestial empire, appear themselves to have been a Scythian people, and therefore only early settled and civilized Tartars. Their manners, says Dr. Latham, in many respects greatly resemble those peculiar to the Scythian tribes described by Herodotus. A German author has pointed out 17 different customs which are identical in the Chinese and Turks. Their language has been proven to be by no means so dissimilar to all other nations as has formerly been supposed. And the dragon, the emblem of Scythia, is used alike by the Slavonian, Chinese, and Tartars. Encyclopedia Britannica, Dr. Latham. About 600 years before Christ, a horde of Scythians conquered India, and one of their tribes, the fair-haired, blue-eyed Getae, returning towards the north and establishing themselves in the plains to the east of the Caspian, finally settled in Scandinavia, leaving a few who are still called Jits in Hindustan. While in Europe, they became known and celebrated by the name of Goths. Until towards the latter end of the last century, when the ambition and conquests of her sovereigns had brought Russia into close contact and opposition with the other more advanced nations of Europe, she had been considered by her contemporaries of the West as rather an Asiatic than a European power, too barbarous and remote to contend with their statesmen in the cabinet or maintain any interest or influence in common with their own, and shut out by the stormy Poland, her severe and rigorous climate, and the exclusive policy of her government from trade or intimate connection with the rest of the continent. She had long been surely and gradually increasing both in power and extent, though hardly known and unheeded except by a few far-sighted politicians and the neighboring states with whom she was continually at war. This isolation may be considered to have commenced in the 11th and 12th centuries, when a career of prosperity and conquest, which might have ended in the subjugation of the then darker and more ignorant nations of the West, was cut short by the perpetual inroads of the savage Tartar tribes, who hovered on her eastern border, and the civil discords of her princes, and later by the rapid conquests of the Mongols, under whom she was long held in slavery. Neither history nor tradition has left us any positive information. When the first colonists from Asia entered Europe, but it is generally considered that the Finns were the first inhabitants of Russia, and indeed of the whole continent, and that they were from thence driven gradually northwards to the extremities of Norway, Finland, and Lapland, where they now dwell, by the second immigration, which was probably that of the Celts, while the Finns retreated towards the north. This last people moved on to the west, being expelled from the Russian steppes by a fresh horde of invaders, the Scythians, who, scattering the inhabitants before them like chaff, precipitated themselves upon Eastern Europe. Their families and cattle encamped upon her extensive plains, which have successively pastured the flocks of the Finns, Celts, Scythians, Goths, Huns, and Mongols, the inhospitable climate denying to a people not skilled in agriculture any other mode of supporting life than that of wandering shepherds or hunters. But since the power of the last of these invaders was overthrown, the Russian Empire has continued to increase in extent and power till it now embraces a sixth of the habitable portion of the globe, and extending from the borders of the Pacific Ocean to those of the Baltic Sea, and from the ice-bound shores of the Arctic to the sunny and fertile lands of Persia and Armenia. The greatest diversity is to be found in the inhabitants, climate, vegetation, and general aspect of the country, the former comprising nearly 100 different nations, for the handsome Georgian, the swarthy Tatar, the fair Estonian, the Persian or Erevan, the small and timid Lap, the Geber or of Baku, the fish-eating Samoyed, and the Boyard of Moscow, all alike own the sway of the Tsar. In the north were gloomy forests of pine and fir, with deep bogs and extensive marshes cover the face of the country, till they are reduced on the shores of the White Sea and frozen ocean to scanty woods of the dwarfish birch and larch. The inhabitants are drawn in their sledges by the reindeer and strong and shaggy Samoyed dog, while in the south the arid steppes overspread with grass are traversed by the camel and Araba, whose drivers, the few nomadic tribes still roaming across these sandy wastes, belong to the horde of Nogai Tartars, the peaceful and insignificant descendants of the last and fiercest conquerors of the empire. The only mountains of any extent that break the uniformity of the level landscape in Russia are the Urals, known to the ancients as the Riphean chain, which divide Europe from Asia, the hills of the Caucasus, whose lofty peaks, famous in Grecian fable and Persian song, rise beyond the steppes of the Don and the Black Sea, and further south in the kingdom of Georgia, where the vine, mulberry, and orange luxuriantly and uncultivated grow, lies the solitary and snow-capped Mount of Ararat, celebrated as the resting place of the Ark. Her rivers, of which the Volga is the longest in Europe, are navigable almost to their source, and being connected by canals, form a communication between the Black, Caspian, White, and Baltic seas, though, from the scarcity of water in these parts, several attempts to unite the Don and Volga. They have been joined within the last few years by a tram railway. Though, from scarcity of water in these parts, several attempts to unite the Don and Volga, which approach to within a distance of 40 miles, have failed, and they are rendered useless during many months of the year by the ice, which annually blocks up every harbor in the empire, with the exception of 2 or 3 on the Euxine, thus forming a great impediment to the commerce of Russia by sea, and causing her to carry on a comparatively larger trade by caravans with Siberia, China, and all Central Asia, than with the other nations of Europe. The limits of no empire have so frequently changed as those of Russia, her territories having spread in the early period of her history over nearly the same extent of country in Europe that they at present occupy. While in the beginning of the 16th century, when she finally emancipated herself from the Tartar rule, they had dwindled down to little more than Moscow, her capital, and a few surrounding provinces, then known as Muscovy. The kingdoms of Poland, Georgia, Siberia, Kazan, Astrakhan, and the Crimea, with a part of Armenia and the Grand Duchy of Finland, are now included within her frontiers, where, though the Slavonian is the most considerable and dominant race, Professor Retzius of Stockholm maintains that the Slavonians themselves do not belong to the Caucasian division of the human family. Dr. Latham considers that 9/10 of the modern Russians and inhabitants of Russia are of the Tartar race, or as he denominates it, the Ugrian, in which category he comprises the Huns, Finns, Kalmucks, and all the Tartar tribes in the empire except the Bashkirs. It has probably very much intermingled with the Tartar tribes, by whom it has been so frequently subdued, particularly the Mongols, its latest foreign masters, from whom 130 noble Russian families are descended, besides many of the common people. Numerous words in the Russian language are also derived from the same source. Several of their names for weights, measures, and coins, the punishment of the knout, various legal customs, habits of life, and articles of dress, with many of the forms and ceremonies at their court. The Scythians are the first inhabitants of Russia of whom we have any knowledge. They peopled the north of Asia and the east of Europe, and from the most distant times frequently overthrew the thrones of southern Asia, penetrating on one occasion even as far as Egypt, where before the days of the pharaohs they founded a dynasty called the Hyksos, or shepherd kings. In the 5th book of the Chronicles of Berosus the Chaldean, that ancient writer informs us that Nimrod sent Assyrians, Medus, Moscus, and Magog to found colonies in various parts of Asia and Europe, and that Moscus planted settlements in both continents. This account has given rise to the supposition that Moscus came to European Scythia, and that from him the river Moskowa received its name. Some historians have conjectured that this name was derived from Mesek, a son of Japhet, and quote the passage from Ezekiel which describes Mesek as supplying Tyre with staves and brazen vessels. The Tartars from the earliest ages have been skillful in working metals in support of their argument. While Assyrius was father of the Assyrian, Medus of the Medes, and Magog of the eastern Scythians or Tartars. Herodotus describes these people as inhabiting a country to the westward of the Tanais, from whence they had driven the Cimeri, or a Celtic tribe. Herodotus states that in his time there were still many monuments and bridges erected by the Cimmerians in Scythia, whom Niebuhr supposes retired towards the west. Herodotus describes these people as inhabiting a country to the westward of the Tanais, from whence they had driven the Cimeri, a Celtic tribe, whom Niebuhr supposes retired towards the west and emigrated from Scythia into the countries of the Danube. And according to Sir Isaac Newton, both nations must have spread themselves over Europe and Lesser Asia before the year of the flood, 1220. That is, about the same time of the Israelitish judges. The Scythian hordes who came into Europe had been expelled from the east ward of the Caspian by the Massaget, another of their tribes who had been The Scythian hordes who came into Europe had been expelled from the eastward of the Caspian by the Massaget, another of their tribes, who had been dispossessed of their own country by Ninus, king of Assyria, and they appear to have carried on some commerce with the Greeks, as we learn from the historian that the caravans of Greek merchants who traded up the Tanais or Don towards the Ural Mountains were always accompanied by 7 interpreters speaking as many different languages. In the annals of Persia, all the country north of the Caucasus and river Oxus is called Turan, or land of darkness, in contradistinction to Iran, or the land of the sun. In the annals of Persia, all the country north of the Caucasus and river Oxus is called Turan, or land of darkness, in contradistinction to Iran, or the land of the sun. And their history transmits the record of perpetual wars. Carried on between the two nations from the most remote period of antiquity. The Persian poets celebrate in many of their songs the glories and magnificence of Afrasib, an ancient king of the Turanians. The numbers of his retinue and splendid court. He was the rival of their favorite hero, Rustem, whose fame has been recorded in an Iranian poem of 10,000 verses. The Turanian kings, like the pharaohs of Egypt, were all known by the name of Afrasib. The same manners, customs, and mode of living appear to have been The same manner, customs, and mode of living appear to have prevailed among all the tribes of the Scythians from the shores of the Euxine to where they encountered the empire of the Huns on the borders of China, and closely resemble those of the modern Tartars. Their plains abounded in wild horses, one of which was possessed by every warrior, whose arms consisted of wooden spears or javelins, a bow, and a quiver of poisoned arrows, and in passing a river. In 1240, when the Mongols besieged Kiev, they crossed the Dnieper in the same manner. Their plains abounded in wild horses, one of which was possessed by every warrior, whose arms consisted of wooden spears or javelins, a bow, and a quiver of poisoned arrows, and in passing a river they made use of their saddles, consisting of leather sacks stuffed with straw, upon which they sat, causing their horses, whose tails they held, to swim before them, and thus float them across. When two Scythians wished to swear an eternal friendship, they were accustomed to make an incision in their bodies, and, mingling their blood in a cup, first dipped into the vessel the points of their swords, and then sucked the ends. But the geography and history of Scythia appears to have been very imperfectly known to the Greeks, to whom she gave two philosophers, Artemidorus of Ephesus, a geographer who flourished about the year 100 BC, stated that the country east of the Tanais was unexplored, and so late as after the expedition of Alexander the Great, the Caspian was believed to be a gulf of the Northern Ocean, and Pliny informs us that his contemporaries supposed the Pyos Sea of Azov to be connected with the Arctic Sea. The Volga was unknown to the Greeks, and is first mentioned under the name of Ra by the Roman writers. It is a common opinion among the most eminent geologists that till within a comparatively recent period of the world's history, the Caspian and Black Seas were connected, and that the ocean overflowed the sandy steppes that now lie between them to the north of the Caucasus, which are still strongly impregnated with salt and shells. Herodotus speaks of the Sea of Azov as being of about the same extent as the Black Sea. But the geography and history of Scythia appears to have been very imperfectly known to the Greeks, to whom she gave two philosophers, and who celebrated in their songs in the days of Homer the peace and innocence of the pastoral life as existed upon her plains, unaware of the savage manners of her people, and the frequency with which those verdant fields were stained with blood.